Most men lead lives of quiet desperation. Henry David Thoreau made that statement in his book Walden, which was published in 1784. I think that statement is even more true today. Most people today lead lives of quiet desperation. But what does it mean to lead a life of quiet desperation? It means that we settle, that we listen to others rather than listening to our own hearts, our own inner wisdom. It means that we merely exist instead of fully living. I was one of those people. I lived a life of quiet desperation. Until 7 years ago, I made a radical change and I restarted my life. 7 years ago, I made the decision to leave the religious community in which I had been raised and in which I had grown up and been an active participant until that time, so that I could live differently. I had spent decades supporting myself, living on my own, doing everything needed to exist effectively. I made the decision to leave so that I could begin to live fully and authentically. I had accepted a life of quiet desperation for decades because I was afraid. I was afraid of being alone. I was afraid of effecting change that would cause me to become separated from the people and the community I had known my entire life. And that is an understandable fear. As human beings, we are social creatures. We thrive when we have a network of connections with whom we interact. Our connections, they provide our personal context, our identity. Take our connections away, and we have no identity. That fear, while being understandable, can also entrap us. Fear of being alone can keep us chained to circumstances, situations, people whom we didn't consciously choose, who don't have a positive impact on our lives, who might even potentially hurt us. I reached the point where I had to face my fear. I had to change my life because merely existing was not enough anymore. Today I'm facing that fear in a whole new way. This is the first time I'm sharing my story in public and globally as I'm doing it in a TEDx event. But I chose to share my story in the hopes that it would help others who might be going through the same type of transition. My journey is about leaving a religious community. A community that impacted, influenced, and shaped who I became, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. To leave that community was a life-altering experience, but many people have many different types of life-altering experiences. And when we go through a life-altering experience, we have to restart the machines of our lives to begin again. How do we do that? My approach has been to focus on 3 primary elements: review, rebuild, and reclaim. Review is the first step in making the transition from merely existing to fully living. It is when we begin to review, when we look deep into ourselves to identify the things that are making us unhappy, that are creating us to feel like we live in a state of quiet desperation. That is when we gain clarity. And when we gain clarity, we must take action. When we identify the things that are not working for us, we have to remove ourselves from those things. We can't expect those things to change. We must remove ourselves from the things that impact our happiness. How many people can say that they are truly happy? When I look back over my life, I can't say that. I recall much more fear and loneliness. And those are the types of things that we need to be aware of. Those are the types of things that we need to start taking action on. When I came to that realization, I knew I needed to change. But it was only in doing that reflection that I realized that many of the things that I had thought were positive, and the community in which I was raised offered many, many valuable guidelines in terms of morals and ethics, But some of the things involved in that didn't actually serve me. When I was a child, I was only allowed to have friends of the same religious community. And as I grew up in a very small town with a very small population, my choices were pretty limited. So I became a reader. I spent more time reading books than I spent engaging with other people. There's nothing wrong with reading. I am still a voracious reader. But I felt really lonely. And I thought there was something wrong with me for feeling that way. I now realize that wasn't my fault. When I became an adult, I chose to stay within the guidelines of that religious community. I left the small town, I moved to a major metropolitan area, I got my first proper job. I started engaging with all kinds of people, and I became more outgoing and extroverted in general. But my soul still craved companionship. The men in the religious community, let's just say they weren't really my type. So I spent a lot of time single. Once again, feeling very lonely. In my mid-20s, I fell deeply in love with someone with whom I worked, and he felt the same about me. But he was not of the same religious faith. And although we maintained a relationship for quite a while, I eventually ended it because of the religious differences. We were both completely heartbroken, utterly devastated. And I spent almost the next decade being single. I seemed to have a full and busy life, but my soul craved companionship. I was merely existing. I was not fully living. What I realized was that although some of those principles and guidelines that I had been taught very much benefited me, I needed to make a change. And that led me to the next step in my journey, and that was to rebuild. My process of rebuilding was rather challenging. For one, I had to cope with new elements of loneliness and aloneness than I'd ever done before, because I had disconnected myself from the only people in community I'd ever known. I also had to learn to process information differently, change some of the fundamental ways of thinking that I had always maintained. I was no longer connected to the community or the guidelines that suggested what I should do, offered to help me figure out what to do, or just flat out told me what to do with my life. I suddenly had to start taking in information and processing it and coming to different decisions on my own in a way I'd never done before. And I also needed to be aware of what my needs were through this process. And that was a really hard thing to do as well. I ended up finding myself feeling very alone and very alienated because I had an underlying sense of judgment pending or disapproval pending. And as a result, I ended up becoming almost very secretive about my life, still engaging with people, but not actually sharing elements of my past with them or sharing the transition that I was going through. And I know now in hindsight, that was not the best way to go about things. As human beings, we heal much more quickly when we allow others to help us. Allowing ourselves to be vulnerable and ask for support makes us stronger and allows us to move forward in our lives much more quickly than we would have done. I also had to identify what my primary beliefs were. Most of us maintain many of the beliefs and values that we are taught as children, mainly from our parents, but from other authority figures as well. Think about your own life, the things that you were taught as a child. How do they still impact you today? Your choice of politics, your religion, your job, your hobbies, your friends, how you divide your time between those things, your choice of washing up liquid. For years, my sister and I bought the same washing up liquid that my mother did, just because we always had. So oftentimes, we, without realizing it, follow patterns and behaviors just because we always have done. It ended up being a bit different for me. While I do still maintain some of the values that I was taught, I had to create a new identity. I had to create new beliefs. I had to create new relationships. And I wanted to do that without any bitterness or regret. And that was difficult, and again, led me to keeping very insulated within myself. But once I got through the rebuild process, it was time to move on. When we go through major changes in our lives, when we have to restart our lives, how do we begin them again? How do we reclaim our lives? As I believe we all do, throughout our lives, I'm still developing who I am and creating the life that I want to live. One thing I've had to be aware of with myself is that I do have an underlying sense of impending judgment. I expect people to be disapproving. I expect them to be ready to condemn me. And what that has translated into within me is self-sabotaging behavior. Because if I punish myself, then there's no need for anyone else to do it. And some of the ways that I manifest that are really quite simple. I don't give myself enough sleep. I go to bed too late almost every single night, which means I wake up in the morning. When I get up in the morning, I feel tired. I go throughout my day feeling tired. I can't be my best. Why do I do that to myself? Is it because perhaps at a subconscious level, I am judging myself for trying to create a new life? I don't need to punish or judge myself. I need to forgive myself. That's a new lesson for me, one that I'm still working through. I also try to be very conscious of the people with whom I spend time. If we just replace one set of people who had a negative impact on us with a differing set of people who still have a negative impact on us, we're not doing ourselves any favor. I need to find and surround myself with people who exude positive energy, who demonstrate the values that I resonate with, who actually are living the types of lives that they choose and that I want to emulate. Could the same be true for you? For all the challenges that my past had, I really try to focus on the positive and the good that it contained, because it absolutely did. Many of the qualities and characteristics I still have today are things that I want to continue using in my life as I continue creating the life that I want to live. And I think that is very important too, because if we get hung up on negative emotions, and it's so easy to do so when you leave a community, a culture, or relationship, very easy to be angry, sad, fearful, at times even be full of rage. Those things don't serve us at all. Those negative emotions actually serve as anchors to the past. And what we need to do is take the energy from those emotions, and although we need to acknowledge them as being guardians, it's how our psyche tries to prevent us from getting into similar situations in the future. We need to take the energy from those emotions and redirect it into positive, beneficial behaviors that serve us and the new lives that we are creating. Thoreau made the statement that most men lead lives of quiet desperation. He was right. Let's change that. If you at all feel as though you are merely existing, know in your hearts that you too can review, rebuild, and reclaim your lives as I am doing. Know that you too can go from mere existence to a life fully lived.